first book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit, won the prestigious Bancroft Award in History. Professor Harkavy already sort of was introduced by the video. He's co-author and editor of 5 books and has published numerous articles and chapters on university, civic, and community engagement, and he won the Penn Alumni Award of Merit. Joe Klein is Times political columnist, author of 6 books, including I think Primary Colors, about this guy from Arkansas, and
although he was never named.
Right, and most recently, Politics Lost. His weekly Time column, In the Arena, covers national and international affairs. He twice won the National Headline Awards for Best Magazine Column and the Peter Kiss Award for Outstanding Reporting in New York City Government and Public Affairs. So I thought we could begin with Ira, who, before I was going to say, could discuss the video. Now we can finish the video. Ira.
Well, rather than finishing the video, I'll come to that in a bit. The video, just to indicate where it goes, it's about the need to change higher education and Penn's national and global leadership of becoming engaged through the scholarship and activity of its students and faculty in West Philadelphia as a model for democratic learning and development. But what I'd like to do is really just talk a little bit about my own personal experience at Penn. So fellow classmates, I'm a class of 70 graduate, was very involved in anti-war and anti-racism activities related very deeply to Penn's treatment of its community, which I view as one of the two, that and anti-war activity, the two major foci of student protests. And if I think back on my experience at Penn, and I'll speak about some general themes, I see that Penn really became transformed in this spring of 1968, and that happened all over the country. So I entered here in the fall of '66. Penn was a relatively conservative institution. I came from a very activist-oriented background and found Penn to be outside, in fact, of a whole set of activities that I was interested in. But that spring, as you all may remember, because you all were, one of your classes was still in high school and the other was on its way to graduate, really was momentous. It was momentous from the McCarthy campaign, where he lost by something like 230 votes, that changed the political framework. And I think that was March 12th. By March 16th, I think Bobby Kennedy entered the race, and by the 31st of March, Lyndon Johnson indicated he would not run for president. In April, we, of course, know of the assassination of Dr. King, and it was also the month of student protests worldwide. It wasn't just in Colombia, but it was France, and it was in a particular moment, but also in Germany. And we can go into the months of June and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, to the events of that summer, where the Democratic Convention occurred and the riots in Chicago, often seen as police-related riots, and the collapse of the Prague Spring, the collapse of the great developments to create democratic societies when Soviet tanks, if I recall, on August 20th, appeared in the streets of Prague. And also then the development that fall of the more visibility to the women's movement and the protests in Atlantic City and feminist movement. By the fall of 1968, Penn wasn't the same. When I returned to campus, people looked different, focused on different things, cared about different things, and suddenly there was a tremendous energy that would capture about the issues of the 70s. And I can talk about issues later when I was involved in leading the sit-in at Penn in the spring of '69 and other activities. Maybe we can come back to that later. And I think the issues, though, that began to be seen in that year, and was seen earlier in the 60s, I think are 3 primary themes I'd like to touch on, and then talk about the legacy. And that's partly what that tape talks about, the video, rather, the legacy of the 60s. So that in a certain respect, I think there were 3 fundamental themes. One had to do with the issue of civil rights and anti-racism. The other had to do with peace and anti-war. And the third theme that has become a legacy that I know most about because I work in that area is the role of democratic education and the transformation of higher education. And that was seen as a critique of higher education as being complicit in the war or complicit in destruction of poor communities, at worst, perhaps as bad, the irrelevancy of what we learn and how we learn it. That we weren't learning to be connected to the world. And the third component was much more hopeful, was the possibilities of education. The humanistic, transformative power of learning, but of higher education. Now, to get ready for this, to speak to you today, last night I decided to read the Port Huron Statement, 1962, the early document of SDS, when SDS, before it went off the rails and became completely insane, was written really by Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis, as Joe and I were talking about in the early 60s. I was profoundly impressed with its emphasis on something I write about, and how much John Dewey, the great pragmatic philosopher of democracy, as Robert Westbrook, the historian, has written, that really Dewey was the great figure in advancing the idea of participatory democracy, face-to-face democracy. But what really impressed me was, in the less academic sense in my own work, was how higher education was at the very center of the diagnostic as well as the solution to helping America to realize its unrealized democratic promise. So if you read that piece, you see in the diagnosis, and you can say, well, it's students, but student movements did not focus historically the same way on higher education as this movement did. It said higher education was responsible for apathy and the lack of citizenship. It went on to talk about the separation of students from the material they studied. And it led to a parochial view of research and scholarship and a truncated understanding of students of democratic life. That's the third component. But the Port Huron Statement went further and then talked about, in their conclusions, alternatives to helplessness. And they discussed the university as the key institution with social influence. They went on to discuss that it was the core institution because in advanced societies, knowledge production and dissemination and education of young people for citizenship were the key to a good country. The key for America to realize and achieve its potentiality. And I'll just quote one part, just to quote this. They conclude, and I'll talk about the legacy of the 60s on this note. To turn these possibilities into realities will involve national efforts at university reform by an alliance of students and faculty. They must wrest control of educational processes from administrative bureaucracies. They must make fraternal and functional contact with allies in labor, civil rights, liberal forces outside of campus. They must import major public issues into the curriculum. Research and teaching on problems of war and peace is just one outstanding example. The idea, and this is really what I'm going to touch on, the integration of academic work with the world. With the world. Not education for its own sake, but education for the sake of a better society. Knowledge, as Francis Bacon, the great philosopher of science, wrote, for the relief of man's estate, to improve human life. And they go on to say they must, besides importing major issues, they must make debate and controversy not dull and pedantic cant, but controversy and discussion and engagement, in effect, the style of educational life. Look at that optimism. The potentiality of change. But that changed, in my judgment. I'll hear from an expert in a minute and someone who knows more about this than I do from studying it. This is not the focus of my research. But in fact, what ended up happening was, I would argue, that Soviet tanks in the streets of Czechoslovakia and the Democratic Convention started a turn to a sense that change could not be so easily produced. And nihilism and a focus on self-gratification increasingly became more and more center. And this is what that video that Penn produced for our 20th anniversary indicates, that, in fact, rather than changing the institutions, it all was outside the institution. The institutions became, in fact, negative and were not seen as potentials for change. And what, then, is the legacy of that? What is the legacy? And now on a hopeful note, and Penn, without tooting our own horn. It is a fact that we are seen probably as the most civically engaged, certainly major institution in the country, if not the world, and we have miles and miles and miles and miles to go before we rest. But there is a higher education civic engagement movement that would not have happened without the 1960s. It's when the growth of service learning, for instance, a form of active learning pedagogy, which our colleague at Penn, Matt Hartley, did a study of in a piece we did, which shows in his analysis of all the educational reforms that have occurred since the founding of the Research University at Johns Hopkins in 1876, no pedagogy has had as wide a dispersion and impact as engaged learning of that kind of relevance, of learning to solve problems in the world. The development in the United States of a group called Campus Compact is one indicator. It started with 3 universities in 1985, now has 1,200 or more members at over a quarter of higher educational institutions in the United States. Council of Europe, representing 46 European countries, works with a group that I chair called the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility and Democracy on a focus of the university's role in developing democratic life on exactly the same platform that the Port Huron statement said. It's the core institution for advanced societies and for improving the world. The storehouse of knowledge, the creation of knowledge, the largest anchors in communities. Penn is the largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania next to Walmart. The largest employer in the city of Philadelphia. 4 of the 5 largest employers in this city are eds or meds, higher eds or medical institutions. Another indicator could be the conference we held at the Netter Center when 500 colleagues from 80 countries came to talk not about our celebration, but the celebration of a movement, and the fact that here we have about 60 courses and about 2,400 students involved in this work every year, but they were speaking of their own activities, 10 countries. How does the 60s affect that? It was that emphasis on the side of it within institutions as well as outside change could result. It represented more of that buoyant optimism from early on. It builds on black studies, women's studies, other ethnic studies that began to change and developed in the late 60s, the understanding of what universities could and should do. And in fact, it was university leadership. Penn's last 3 presidents, Hackney, Roden, and President Gutman, all were students in the 1960s. If you look at the involvement, and Bill Keller is vice president of Kingsborough Community College, you look at the presidents of those institutions, they're all refugees from the 60s. All of them involved in exactly these kind of efforts. So let me just conclude in terms of legacy. That legacy has to be live. What I think was identified very clearly was a strategic issue: no democratic education, no democratic society. No democratic engaged university, no democratic schooling system. The universities could have a huge effect. When I was an undergraduate, I chaired CIC, the Community Involvement Council. It was the largest organization at Penn involved in local schools. No engaged university, democratic universities, no democratic schools, no democratic society, but it's contested terrain. Universities now, the legacy, although has advanced, it's unclear where they'll go. So the struggle continues. Will there be a return? We were talking about this with some colleagues who view everything within the discipline, learning for the discipline's sake. Or is it learning for just jobs and employment? That's a big debate now. Or is there education to help realize America's unrealized democratic promise? And for Penn, our alma mater, founded by Franklin, the answer is clear. Franklin, when he founded Penn, said the purpose of Penn was to educate young people. He said, men with an inclination, moral, joined with an ability to serve mankind, human beings, one country, friend, and family. Service. Will the focus of learning, of higher education, be for its own sake, for the disciplines, merely, for just employment, or will it be to help assure a decent and fair quality of life for every citizen in America and around the world? To be continued. Thank you very much.
We'll now turn to Tom, who'll give us a historical perspective.
Great. Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here. I started at Penn in 1991 and joined an institution that had, as Ira described, been changed in fundamental ways as a consequence of the social and political movements of the 1960s. But I'm going to offer a somewhat different take on the 1960s. Let me first put this back on my lapel. I'm going to offer a somewhat different take on the 1960s, one that looks at what I would call the many 1960s. There was a slogan in the 1960s, one, two, many Vietnams. And what we see here at Penn and the nation writ large is a very diverse set of experiences in the 1960s. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. About 10 years ago, I introduced a new assignment in my course on America in the 1960s, a course I've been teaching since the very first semester I arrived here. I assigned my students to go out and conduct interviews, oral histories, with people who have participated or lived through or experienced the 1960s in one way or another. Now, that's led to a lot of really interesting papers. A few audacious students every year will go after a trophy, someone really famous. Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine, was interviewed by my students one of my students one year. Former Chicago Mayor Richard M. Richie Daley, the son of the mayor who presided over the tumult at the 1968 Democratic Convention, was the subject of one of my students' papers. Phyllis Schlafly, one of the leading voices of the right, whose famous essay, A Choice, Not an Echo, was important and instrumental in the rise of the right, was an interview subject of one of my students. Ira Harkavy has generously consented to be interviewed by students in my class. Sometimes my students interview subjects who had an encounter or a brush or maybe a little bit more with fame in the 1960s. One of my students' mom, who grew up in a nice Jewish family in Scarsdale, New York, graduated from high school, moved down to Greenwich Village, and had an affair with Jimi Hendrix. She was probably one of about 150 or so women who had affairs with Jimi Hendrix, at least to the best of our knowledge. Unfortunately, my student wasn't much interested in pursuing that avenue. She was interested in documenting the song lyrics that inspired her mom in the 1960s. Not maybe as interesting a paper as it could have been otherwise. And not for prurient matters, I was kind of curious as to what did mom and dad think about their daughter going down and living in the village and hanging out with this rather outre crowd? Others are perhaps a little bit more bizarre. One of my students interviewed a family, one of whose members became a sort of a depressed prophet of gloom, roaming across the United States, renaming himself Job, and living off of handouts over the course of the 60s and early 1970s. Some of these folks who've been interviewed were quite interesting. They stand out. One was a leader in the civil rights and black power movements in Philadelphia. Another student had an Orthodox Jewish uncle from Brooklyn who led resistance to the Vietnam War in his community, not known for its left-wing politics in the 1960s. One student interviewed her mother, who was the only white member of the Black Students Association at USC, the University of Southern California, in 1970. One of my students just this semester interviewed a longtime labor organizer, now in her 90s, who believed in combining feminism with working class rights and made a distinguished career in doing so. All those interesting stories aside, the vast majority of the subjects that my students interview were not wrapped up in the social movements in the 1960s, were not famous, didn't even know famous people, maybe saw them every once in a while on television. And one of the most common questions I get from my students when they're given this assignment and they go off to grandpa or mom or dad or Norman Podhoretz, one of the most common questions I get is, so-and-so wasn't doing anything in the 1960s. Of course, they were doing something in the 1960s. They were alive. They were engaged in one way or another with the cultural, the social, and the political transformations of the period. They were suburban housewives. They were in devout religious families. They were folks who were raising their children and raising money to send them to college. They were folks who were engaged in pretty much the ordinary affairs of everyday life. So one of the many 1960s that I think we ought to be thinking about as we look at that period are the folks who went through the 1960s, being touched by in certain respects, in other ways not being touched by the profound social movements and politics that were remaking the period. Over the last 40 years, the 1960s have become a touchstone in American politics and popular culture, really now 50 years. Richard Nixon in 1968 and 1972 railed against disorder in the streets and acid amnesty and abortion. Jimmy Carter ran as a kind of new Democrat who would turn the clock back to the moment of community and would undo many of what he saw as a Democrat, the excesses of the Great Society and war on poverty. Ronald Reagan promised to restore American greatness, looking romantically at the 1940s and 1950s. George H.W. Bush promised to undo the Vietnam syndrome. Newt Gingrich labeled Bill Clinton a counterculture McGovernick and a draft dodger. But Clinton distanced himself from his 1960s past as a protester, claiming that he didn't inhale. In 2000 and 2004, once again, the 60s returned with a vengeance as Vietnam veterans Al Gore and John Kerry touted their military service, but still faced unfriendly fire by conservatives who challenged their patriotism, rehashing many of the debates about the war that arose in the 1960s. By and large, campaigns leading up to the election of Barack Obama, our first president who did not in fundamental ways live through the 1960s. He was only 8 when the decade ended. These political campaigns have made the 60s a touchstone. John McCain began his campaign in 2008 with an ad called Summer of Love that showed visions of protesters and demonstrations in the street, and then showed him in uniform returning from his experience, his own 1960s, as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And for his part, Barack Obama, despite the fact he was tarred by association with various 60s radicals, including the former Weather Underground activist Bill Ayers, positioned himself as an anti-1960s candidate, as someone who transcended the period, as someone who was not swept up by what he called the psychocultural battles of that period. To a great extent, we live in a country where our memories of the 1960s still shape our politics and popular culture. In fact, in thinking about the 1960s, we need to grapple with the relationship of memory and history, for at least to some extent, in how we tell the history of the recent past. How we remember the history of the period reflects our current position, our political commitments, our engagements, and to a great extent, I would argue, and my students certainly hear this in class, we need to take a look at the ways in which the 1960s meant different things for different people involved. It can't simply be boiled down to the sound bites that continue to dominate American political discourse or debate. By and large, there are two versions of the 1960s that still shape how we tell the story of the period, and you'll find it in the vast library of books that have been published since the 60s began on the 1960s, talking about them as a phenomenon. Basically, it can be divided into two categories. The good 1960s. This is a moment of liberatory possibility, of challenges to authority, of resistance to the conformity and blandness of mid-20th century American culture, of democratization. On the other hand, the bad 1960s, the moment that unleashed all of the pernicious forces that have undermined morality and family in the United States today. Barbarous feminism. At the same time, social movements that spelled America with a K or with 3 Ks, arguing that the United States was a barbarous imperial nation. Folks arguing that the United States began, in the words of Judge Bork, another veteran of the 1960s in his own way, slouching toward Gomorrah as a result of the sexual liberation movements, the open acceptance of homosexuality, and the changing role of women in everyday American life. My interviews, the oral histories, and the experience of so many people living through the 1960s suggest that we have to come up with some alternative lenses to think about the period that go beyond the simple polarization and partisan divisions that continue to shape how we understand and interpret that period. So what I want to do for the last couple of minutes is just suggest a few ways of rethinking the 1960s that go past this polarized or binaristic or dualistic way of thinking about the period. First, we need to look at the ways in which the 1960s did unleash changes that have shaped every aspect of American life. And I'm going to focus on just two of them very quickly. One has been the subject of much of my scholarship, and that is the civil rights struggle. The other is something that hasn't been written much about by historians, but is really momentous, and that is immigration. Both the civil rights struggle of the 1960s and the immigration reform of 1965 have changed the color of America. They've changed the faces that we see in my department at the history department at Penn and in American society writ large. But lest we celebrate this moment, the 1960s also witnessed increased polarization and division, largely as a result of balkanization. Groups, and not just groups associated in the culture wars with the so-called identity politics of the 1980s and 1990s, but all sorts of groups. Groups that many of us belong to, religious and ethnic groups, racial groups, began to see their interests in contradistinction to other interests. The notion of there being a broad common United States, one that would integrate or pull people together, began to fragment into shards, and to a great extent that fragmentation remains very much part of the terrain. The 1960s is often portrayed, and if you watch television, pretty much everything except for maybe Mad Men, which does a good 60s, you will find they really are very historically accurate. It's really pretty impressive. You'll find that most accounts of the 1960s focus disproportionately on the left. But the 1960s is a critical period for the rise of the right in the United States. This, of course, is embodied in the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964, the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, but also at the state level. Ronald Reagan, elected governor of California, nicknamed in the 1960s the land of fruit and nuts for its supposed leftist politics. Reagan becomes governor. The South is undergoing profound transformations in this period, and many key Southern Democratic Party candidates are moving into the Republican Party in this period. This is not happening, as conventional wisdom has it, just as a backlash against the social movements in the 1960s. Rather, it's the culmination of decades' worth of grassroots organizing by the right, working through think tanks, working through universities, working through churches to gain a foothold in American society. It blindsided liberals, and to a great extent, it still does. Left and right together in the 1960s shared more in common than they believed at the time. Both left and right were deeply cynical about government and suspicious of liberalism. Indeed, the only circle other than Barry Goldwater's in which liberalism was a bad word was among members of Students for a Democratic Society, who saw liberals as the problem, as the cause of the Vietnam War, as the cause of racial inequality in America, as the cause of so many injustices in American life. So what we see in this period, in other words, is an anti-liberalism and a growing suspicion of government that transcends partisan divisions. To be sure, right and left had their own reasons for being cynical and suspicious of government, but both of them shared that in common. As we look out onto the 1960s, then, we need to account for the folks who weren't doing anything in the 1960s, the folks who found themselves moving toward the right, the folks who were confused and shifted back and forth between right and left, the folks who slept with Jimi Hendrix, and the folks who loathed Jimi Hendrix because they couldn't bear the thought of a counterculturist in such a prominent position in American society. In thinking about the 1960s, in other words, we need to think broadly and to situate the 1960s in some of the largest currents of everyday life as well as national and international politics in the United States. Only then, I think, will we come to a better, more comprehensive and richer understanding of not just the history of the 1960s, but of the moment that we live in today. Thank you.
That was a perfect segue for Joe, who spent the last 40-plus years looking at political and international realm of the world. Joe.
40-plus years. Whoa. I'm not an academic. I don't play one on TV. I have no notes. And so let's talk about us. Let me start with an anecdote. It was in 1992, Bob Rubin, who later went on to great infamy, as the architect of the absence of regulation of Wall Street, put together a small group of us in New York to interview the presidential candidates, the Democratic candidates that year. And there were about 8 or 10 of us, a couple of journalists, mostly banker sorts. And I remember one of these sessions in particular. Of course, I remember the one with Clinton, but this wasn't that. Clinton, of course, showed up 20 minutes late. He was red-faced. He raced through his opening remarks and then just blew everybody away during the Q&A. He knew everybody's Social Security number by the end of that. He knew the age at which we first masturbated. He knew. But Bob Kerrey had a rough go of it because John Chancellor, who was just at the end of his tenure as the anchor of the NBC Nightly News, was completely shit-faced. He was really drunk. And he kept on hammering Bob Kerrey with question after question after question. And finally, Bob Rubin said, John, why don't we let Senator Kerry have a little bit of his dinner? Which was a polite way of saying, would you please shut up? And Chancellor said, wait a second, I have one more question for Senator Kerry. Why on earth did you major in pharmacology at the University of Nebraska? And Kerry shrugged and he said, well, it was the 60s. and that's kind of the 60s that I lived in. A couple of people came up to me earlier and said, I didn't know you were in our budget class. I said, I'd say it's nice to be back here, but I don't know if I was even here when I was here. I mean, it was and I don't know quite why that's true. I entered Penn in '64, intending to, and this goes back to what Ira said, intending to leave in '68 as a member of the Peace Corps. And when I left in '68, I thought the government of the United States was a criminal enterprise. It changed during that time. I think the first signal event was seeing a table downstairs in Houston Hall in the spring of '65, signing up people to go down for Mississippi Summer. To my everlasting shame, I didn't do that. There were a lot of other things I didn't do. I didn't write for the university, for the DP. There were a number of things I didn't do. I did take Murray Murphy's year-long history of the South. I was an American Civ major because it had the fewest requirements. And that began to teach me a lot about what Tom was talking about the rest of the country. And, it's true that there were many different 60s. But I'd like to talk about ours and about what came after for us. Because our generation has really defined American politics, especially on the leftward side, ever since, because we were so huge. We were so big. And I remember, by the way, not only marching down Spruce Street the day after Martin Luther King was shot, but I remember how many people here were at the basketball, the Palestra. God, I'm 66 now. When Bobby Kennedy came to speak in May of '68. And '68 was a real turning point politically. And Nixon's campaign that year was a turning point politically. And the following year, a book came out about that campaign called The Making of the President, 1968, written by a Philadelphia Inquirer columnist, Joe McGinnis. And when I wrote my last book, Politics Lost, I had occasion to go back and read this book, and it was really a startling thing. Because the book opens with a scene that McGinnis thought was absolutely outrageous. Nixon doing a TV ad to camera, saying the same words over and over and over again. McGinnis thought, what a fool. But if you read it now, you see that Nixon refused to take a script from his young political consultant, a fellow by the name of Roger Ailes. And the reason why he was doing it over and over again was that he was perfecting his own language. Think of it. Amazing. And Roger Ailes, the satanic character, was setting up town meetings for Nixon. And he got really ticked off at his staff because they were setting up easy questions for Nixon. And he said, no, I want him to answer the tough questions. Let's stop editing this. Let's have him really go out among the people. Just for contrast, in the last presidential campaign, which was my 10th, God help me, they don't have programs, 12-step programs for political junkies. But I didn't see one event like that where Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, answered candid questions from an unscrubbed audience. And 68 was the beginning of the political process as we have owned it and defined it. It actually began a little bit earlier in 1960 when politicians, most especially Nixon, learned that on this newfangled thing, television, the way you looked was as important, maybe even more important than what you said. Famously, people who listened to the Nixon-Kennedy debates on the radio thought Nixon had won. And so politicians, starting in 1968 with Nixon, began to hire people to tell them how to look on TV. And then those people, who tended to be younger people, people who grew up with television like we did, started saying to him, well, it's not only how you look when you're on TV, you can actually buy advertisements on TV and sell yourself that way. We're going to have to hire another consultant to do that, and maybe another one after that. And then we're going to have to raise a little bit more money to do this. And then we're going to have to raise a hell of a lot more money to do this. And then by 1976, when Jimmy Carter ran and had a child of the 60s named Patrick Cadell as his pollster, you not only had to have experts about making the ads, you had experts who had to poll the ads in advance. You had experts who had to do focus groups to tell you what to say, to tell you what words to use. And by 76, when Carter was elected, Cadell wrote him a memo saying, you are going to have to conduct this presidency. If you want to succeed, you're going to have to conduct it as a permanent campaign. And it's gotten worse from that day to this. It's gone steadily downhill. The night that Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy went into a crowd in Indianapolis who had not, they didn't have cell phones in those days, remember? Had not heard about King's death. The local mayor, who was Richard Lugar, said to Kennedy, we don't want you to come in for this. You shouldn't come in. It's going to be too dangerous. But Kennedy went in anyway. And Adam Walensky, who is his speechwriter, gave him some remarks. And Kennedy just went like this. And he got up on top of a car, and he spoke for 5 minutes. You can hear it on the internet. Sends chills up my spine. It's one of the most amazing speeches. It was one of the last spontaneous speeches under pressure that was ever given by an American politician. And he talked about, he announced that King had died, and you hear these wild wails from the audience, just incredible passion. And he's clearly taken aback, and he's a little bit frightened, and he's hesitant. And he starts to talk about, for the first time in public, a member of my family died. And advises them about what to do now, to stay calm, not to give in to hate. Martin Luther King was about love, not hate. And then, in the climax, he quotes Aeschylus about pain which falls drop by drop upon the human heart until wisdom comes through the awful grace of God. Now, can you imagine any politician doing that now? The Pat Caddell of this moment would say, well, look, we focus tested Aeschylus, and, I don't know whether, going Greek with these, with these uneducated, violently angry people, I don't know if that's going to work. But the thing that we've lost, and that we, our generation, has presided over, has been the loss of spontaneity and the commoditization of politics, the commoditization of everything. I mean, I loved what we accomplished in the 60s. I marched down, I was a foot soldier in the anti-war movement and in the civil rights movement. But I think that we have a lot to answer for what happened ever since. And part of it, we're slaves of technology. I mean, what I've found in my business is that journalists' best asset, a natural skepticism, has slid over into cynicism. I have an aphorism. Cynicism is what passes for insight among the mediocre. And we've been aided and abetted in this by technology. When I arrived at Penn, we had 3 TV networks, 3 flavors of ice cream, unless you went to Hojo's, where there were 24 flavors of ice cream. Now we have, Baskin-Robbins is like passé. They only have like 33 flavors. And we have 1,000 channels of not very much on TV. And in the course of that, what's happened to journalism and what's happened to politics is that we've had to fight for audience. And so a whole generation of people, our children, believe that high-level political debate, serious political discourse, is Pat Buchanan yelling at Eleanor Clift on the McLaughlin Group. I think I'm very tough on my colleagues and on our role in this process. You've heard, if it bleeds, it leads. That goes for politics, too. A few years ago, I started taking trips around the country. I'd been spending a lot of time embedding with our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I came back from Afghanistan one trip. I turned on the TV, and I see all these white people shaking their fists. It was a Tea Party. And I said to myself, where did they come from? And so I did a classic journalistic thing in a kind of newfangled way. I rented an SUV and drove across the country, and I've been doing it every year since. And I crowdsourced it. I'd go on Morning Joe or CNN. There may be 186 people who still watch CNN. And announce it in the magazine. And I'd say, if you have some friends or coworkers who want to get together and talk politics, reach me at my email address. The last trip, I did 40 town meetings in 20 minutes, in 20 days. It felt like 20 minutes. It felt like 20 minutes. In fact, they had to scoop me out of the SUV at the end and deposit me in an airplane. But what I found was that over our time as stewards of this country, people had lost a lot of their sense of citizenship. That we're embarked on a remarkable and I think really dangerous experiment right now, which is to try democracy without citizenship. I named a character in Primary Colors after this phenomenon. It was Orlando Ozio, the governor of Massachusetts, the governor of New York. Machiavelli said that Ozio is the greatest enemy of a republic. What was he talking about? What's Ozio? Ozio is Italian for laziness. And we are the children of Ozio. We are the children of affluence. We have had a 65-year experiment in Ozio in this country. And I wish I could say that the political leaders that we produced measured up to the political leaders that our parents produced, but I can't say that. Not even my favorite, Bill Clinton, who was as smart as a whip, but didn't have the discipline or the ballast even to do the one program that I most loved about him from the start, AmeriCorps, the right way, the right discipline. And that brings us to now. And what I'm seeing from the generation that's coming up. I'm spending a lot of my time now, I said I was embedding. I saw our troops over there in Iraq and Afghanistan doing remarkable things. And I mean really remarkable things, not just being courageous in a, shoot the enemy sort of way, but they were governing these towns. They were governing these towns. They had SERP funds, public works funds. And they would crowdsource the towns and ask people what did they want. And then they would take the people's requests to the local shura. The local shura always wanted the same thing. They always wanted us to spend the money clearing the irrigation ditches near their land so that they could plant poppies and give half the profits to the Taliban. Our kids, I remember Captain Jeremiah Ellis from the University of New Hampshire, 4th Infantry Division, cut a deal with them, gave them a little bit of the money so that they could clear a few irrigation ditches, and spent the rest of the money opening a school for boys and girls in the town of Sanjare, which is the next town over from Mullah Omar's hometown. And I came to the conclusion that these young people, who represent 1% of the population, in fact, they call the rest of us civilians the 99%, that they were going to come back with a different skill set than other troops. And it was going to point them in a direction of public service. And I'm finding that. It's what the book I'm writing right now is all about. But in the end, what I think I've learned over the last 40 years, and I start with, the moral equivalent of having an affair with Jimi Hendrix, smoking dope here for the first time in 1966. But I end up with Ira. Because the thing that we want our kids and now our grandchildren to have in common is not with us. It's with our parents. We want them to have the universal experience of service and sacrifice. Because if they don't, I don't know how we sustain this democracy. If they don't demand different kind of news, different kind of programming from Time Magazine, well, Time Magazine is actually pretty good, compared to, Fox. Al Sharpton is on MSNBC. Unless we raise a generation, and thanks, Ira, that demands that, a generation that are better citizens than we turned out to be, then, our legacy will be remembered as the moment when the country really started to fade downhill. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so now it's your turn. Participatory democracy, it's time for the floor to ask some questions. Yes? Okay. I think there's a microphone for somebody, although it's a small room.
Right
so.
there. Yeah,
Hi. I sort of always have thought of Watergate as being a 60s event, and that the 60s didn't really end until Nixon resigned in '74. Can you comment on...
It was a major turning point, an absolutely major turning point, and it was the sharp break when we began to move from skepticism to cynicism. Because my colleagues, and I plead guilty to this to a certain degree, but not to the extent of some others, my colleagues began to see that you could take down a president. You could write best-selling books. You know, my first job, I was getting paid $95 a week. Wow, Woodward and Bernstein, holy cow. And so I think it began this process of being of selling cynicism about politicians to the public. And it was also a kind of culmination of all that we thought worst about our parents' generation.
I'll just add one small point to Joe's comment, which is that we now have gate as a suffix.
Right.
And many ambitious journalists hope that they'll uncover their gate, whether it be in their local government or in the federal government. And sometimes we overlook a lot of the business that's going on successfully there. What I will say, the other thing about the mid-1970s that's really important, and Ira was whispering this into my ear, is it's a moment of profound economic upheaval, and it changes the terrain upon which all these issues play out. So Watergate's, I think, a really critical turning point, but it's also a turning point in global capitalism. It's the rise of the global economic crisis of the 70s, from which in many respects we haven't come out. It's a beginning of declining incomes and growing income inequality in the United States and in much of the West that hasn't abated since the 1970s. So Nixon is a symbol, but there's more going on as well.
And when I was out in the Midwest at that point, what I was covering was the closing of the steel mills.
Right, so 73 was the beginning of the oil shock and the change of America's relative role in the world. And that really does connect not just to economics and not just to Watergate, but to America's role in terms of foreign policy. The kind of buoyant potentialities begin to change. The 60s, it was guns and butter. 73, America's role no longer was possible to play that role. It began to be felt, and as Tom said, that was a process of readjustment that we've been continually living with. The 60s were a buoyant period in terms of both economic development and American world power. And 73 was partly because of Watergate, but because of economic shift was cold water. It changed the relationship of America to the world, and it changed the relationship of America also in terms of its own sense of political process. That this could happen at the highest levels of power was among the reasons for the cynicism. So even with the sense that there was problems deeply with the government, this confirmed, unfortunately, the worst predictions.
And also the point that we were losing. I remember learning in middle school, or junior high school, which is what they called it then, that America had fought 8 wars and we had won them all.
Right.
And this was the fact that we had lost a war ignominiously and in many ways really in ways that we should be ashamed of. That happening with Watergate, happening with the economy collapsing. Or
same period, right.
Well, the other thing, too, with urbanism is New York City to that point, John
Absolutely.
Lindsay, and then all of a sudden it was on the verge of
That's
bankruptcy.
Right.
And The Cost of Good Intentions was a great, book about that period.
Right.
So a great social experiment failed,
Right.
and it was an amazing turnaround there.
That's true.
Next question.
My question is about the abolition of the draft. It seems to me that once we abolished the draft, we didn't have skin in the game anymore. And one of the things that brought people out in the streets in the 60s was that everyone served. Everyone knew someone who served.
That's true.
We all knew someone in Vietnam. That's not the case anymore. These wonderful people, our wonderful service people that you saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, are volunteers. I bet no one in this room, or I suspect no one in this room, knows a volunteer.
Well, that's kind of the reason why Ira and I are involved in on the periphery of an effort by the Aspen Institute to think through national service. And, I really think, I'm not sure that we can mandate it, but I do think we can incentivize it in a lot of ways. I do think, at the turn of the 90s, I was working for New York Magazine. The city was bankrupt, and I came up with a plan where you could run the city government for a lot less money if you used service. For example, who are the most corrupt people in any given city government? The building inspectors. My way to change that was that the only way you could become a licensed architect or structural engineer in New York is if you spent a couple of years as a building inspector. And you could do this, you could do it across the board. You could provide incentives and mandates. Since this is such a libertarian country, I don't know that you can actually officially. Go ahead, Ira.
No, go ahead.
No, the head of the courts in New York State has proposed that before you become an attorney, you have to do service.
So, I mean, there seems to me there are two related issues. One, it does seem that it was even consciously done that ending the draft would help weaken the protests. There's no question but I think the issue that Joe and Bill are raising has really two components. One is the idea of the role of an experience that brings Americans together. When he was referring to the moral equivalent of war, it was a famous essay by William James that said we needed national service to bring everybody together. But that's insufficient, in my judgment. That's why I emphasize education. Because education itself, at its very core, has at its center in American history, from the founding of the colonial colleges to the land grants to the current developments that I described, at its core, education for democracy. That means education of citizens. It also means knowledge to improve the world. And if it's not in the classrooms of universities, it won't be in the classrooms of elementary, middle, and high schools. And the great development of the 60s, I'm much more optimistic than this guy. And I'll tell you the reason for that is on the education side, when I was a student, this education could have been more irrelevant. I did a paper as an undergraduate, an honors thesis, starting on the Gulf of Tonkin. And that was viewed by the history department, except I had support of Lee Benson and Mike Zuckerman, as akin to doing tiddlywinks. It wasn't the real stuff. And it wasn't the real stuff because it connected to activism in the world. That's what Tom teaches and runs the center. That's the center that I run. That's what my friend and your friend John DiUlio runs. That wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the 1960s. Penn wouldn't be engaged differently in West Philadelphia if I didn't lead protests in the 60s, not just me, but all the students who were part of that, against what Penn was doing to that neighborhood. And what happens is they see the institutional benefit of not having outside, not just protests, but embedding it in the learning of young people. So it's national service, but it's education at all levels for democratic citizenship, but beginning at higher education. Now, to be very clear on that, if Penn doesn't do this, and types of institutions like Penn, and we are a leader, particularly under President Gutman, it doesn't happen in lower schools. So it becomes particularly important, and I think those are the two agendas for the 21st century on.
Right.
National service and service embedded with learning, not separate community service, embedded in solving problems of health, nutrition, poor reading, poor schooling, where the academic resources of the greatest universities of the world work on solving universal problems like poverty, unemployment, inadequate education that are manifested in their communities. And I think that's really key.
By the way, let me just say that I'm not as pessimistic as you think I am.
Good. Glad to hear, Joe. You were disappointing me. You were really disappointing me.
If I were that pessimistic, I'd be up on Cape Cod writing novels.
Good. Okay. Good.
But I'm still slogging away, doing pieces about public service,
right.
Doing pieces about these veterans.
That's exactly right.
And always waiting for the moment that I see a politician do something like Robert Kennedy did that night in April 1968. Right. Always hoping for it.
One other thing I wanted to add to what Ira said, because it was happening, and in fact we're having a reunion, when a group of us became the first urban studies majors, that was really viewed as being a radical, thing. You're supposed to be a sociology or a history or economics major. And, Penn now with the Pick professors, I mean, a lot of it's breaking down those walls in the old disciplines. And when you look at what's available now for the undergraduates, there's so many majors you won't believe it. I mean, it's like biological basis of behavior and PPE, and it's really breaking down the walls.
We have 2 women up here.
Yes. Okay. Seize the day.
My name is Sandy Watts Fisher. I graduated in 64 and also education in 67. In some ways, I feel like this is deja vu. I got 4 men.
No,
All right.
We're white. We're all white.
I agree. I agree. We were asked to serve. That's
I find it shocking.
right.
I said, and you laugh, but this is near and dear to my heart.
That's
I
good.
made a pen. I started in '60, like a lot of women in this room. We had in locus parentis. Remember, we signed out till 11 o'clock at night.
I remember.
We weren't allowed to do things.
Right.
We had the worst gym facilities,
Yes.
okay, and never questioned it. But we did question. A girl in my class was kicked out of Penn for a semester because she'd gone to a back alley abortionist and went through and the dean said don't do it. Those were the days.
That's right.
And what happened is, and I was here in Philadelphia, I was organizing, we held the first women's conference. It was so exciting. And it was held at, though not sponsored by, the Christian
So
Association.
I remember.
And then I was in the room next door in '72 trying to fight to organize to overturn the governor's veto in Pennsylvania for abortion rights. So you guys have mentioned feminism twice, and neither of them in nice terms. The radical ones, the barbaric ones.
I said nice
there's not
thing
a
about it.
person in this room, and especially every woman, who has not been affected by birth control. And it
Absolutely.
gave us control over our lives. And it's given you guys control over your lives too.
You're here.
Thank you.
No,
I'll accept it.
Homeless came in 1973, Title IX. And Title IX, in case you don't know it, was one of the biggest movements to get it through and get the regs written was by Marcia Greenberger, who was a graduate of Penn Law, who founded the National Women's Law Project. And she made it happen that we would have these things. And we had the Women's Center. And head of the Women's Studies is now head of Harvard. So, I mean, it has affected all of us and our daughters and our sons in such an extraordinary way. And I don't like to see it just...
No. Well,
Here.
No,
I will.
wait,
I'll
we're
jump
not
in and say,
I couldn't agree more.
when I teach my course on the 1960s, one of the lines I use in my students when I introduce feminism, actually it's woven throughout the course, which is a sign of how much things have changed in pedagogy. I begin with my little cheeky riff off of Milton Friedman's famous statement, "We are all Keynesians now." And I look out at my students, I say, we are all feminists now. You might not call yourself a feminist. In fact, more and more of my Penn undergraduate women think that if you call yourself a feminist, guys are going to think you're scary. But they are, in fundamental ways, feminists as a result of exactly what you've described in the 1960s, and the very fact that every year, more and more, history of gender, women, sexuality weaves its way, not just as the one add-on lecture, which it often was when I was in graduate school, but really as integral to the course, is a reminder of, in fundamental ways, how much has grown out of the politics that you talk about.
I organized a whole thing at our 25th, and all the guys at our 25th were concerned about Vietnam, and all the women were concerned with other things. It was extraordinary. But each one of you has really talked, when you say there are three great movements, Ira, and you don't mention women's rights and what's happened, I go, what is wrong?
Well, I think that my point was, if you remember, I won't defend what I said, but let me put it in the following terms. I said, first of all, I did say that women's studies was a key component of changing universities. I don't see it, and I'm not a historian of this period. I see its real developments coming in the end of the 60s, as I said, and moving into the 70s. And that was the experience as I would see it. Now, and that does not mean that its movement effects haven't been enormous. And I'll give an example as a teacher. I teach here, and I'll never stop teaching, although I don't have to teach any given semester. The greatest change in teaching are twofold. The nature of a classroom with women, and this began in the 70s, as being intellectual leaders, because I started teaching in the 70s, and now with classrooms with women who are leaders of intellectual conversation, every class at Penn, and the color of the room. I used to teach in rooms that were all white. I used to teach with all people just from America. And when you go teach in a Penn class with bright students, where women and men together are working on important issues and talking about crucial things, and you see students from all over the world, and students of African descent and Latino descent, and it's just talking and working together, the power of diversity on every learner in that room is profound. And I really feel blessed that I teach here, because the students are so bright and the engagement so profound, and this is an example why these diversity issues are so crucial. diversity is not just good for those who are included.
Right.
Diversity is necessary for everybody. For
By the
everybody.
way, this is the first panel I've been on now that with all white
Right, that's true.
men in I don't know how
Me
many
too.
years.
We
I
should
mean,
have boycotted it. We
this
should have
was-
boycotted. You were right. You made me feel like the 60s again. I should have boycotted. I noticed it, but I didn't have the guts to boycott it. Let's be real. I did notice it. It was obvious, but I didn't boycott it.
Could I just add one point? This was the most important liberation movement of our lives because it affected
everybody.
half the population
Everybody.
and affected the rest of us as well.
Right.
All of my best editors, and for us of our age, I started in the underground press, and it was just a given that men and women were equals, and my editors from 1972 on, the vast majority of them, and the best of them were all women, and the last thing I'll say is this: we're getting really close to the point where we have a woman president, and I can't wait.
The only thing I want to add is I work, as was mentioned, at a community college, and over 60% of the school are women, and this is true of communities of color in general. Women are doing so much better than the men that the crisis is with the men.
We got a real
that's
boy
the real
crisis.
issue. Yes, we do.
Yes, this lady.
Yeah, I would like to thank the Penn alumna who just raised that critical issue and just didn't let us slide by, because I think the more empowered women are in a society, you'll find that the more the society is enlightened. So this question is for Professor Sugrue. It's about the left, the fellow travelers, the sympathizers. What's become of them? Did they indeed pursue careers in service and other non-traditional paths, or did they all slip, or did most of them slip into the mainstream and just remember the 60s as a time, or remember it nostalgically?
Great question. Folks who were activists in the 1960s took lots of different paths in their later lives, and some of them shed much of the skin of their activism of the 1960s. But sociological studies, survey research amongst folks who were on the left in the 1960s shows them still disproportionately represented in education, in the helping professions, in being members of organizations, even if they're not doing it in their career, that are committed to questions of social change or social justice. Now, to be sure, the media focuses often with a great, brouhaha on, leftists who have become rightists. A former SDS member who voted for Ronald Reagan, or folks who moved to the Republican Party, or folks who, quote, sold out by climbing down from their hilltop communes and moved to Silicon Valley and got rich. But I think that overplays the fact that many of the folks involved in the 1960s on the left, to one degree or another, some more robustly, some more thinly, have retained attachments to their commitments. And I know you guys, and probably many of you in the room can testify this more than me, a product of the era of Reagan, can testify to.
Yeah, this woman here. Yeah.
Yes.
I have to make a comment before my question. I'm so glad you raised the issue about women. I graduated from Penn in 1953. I was in the college for women. We were not allowed to go to Wharton Engineering or the regular college. We could not come into this building, maybe the first floor, but not above the first floor. So things have changed. My question...
Good.
However, I'm probably the parent that you talked. I don't know. I haven't heard anybody talk about the influence of money and greed and corporations. And here at Penn, and it's wonderful to hear the progressivism expressed on this panel. Where is it in relations to Penn's research on drones? Drones are a totally undemocratic instrument of war, never voted on by anybody in this country. Penn is one of the centers for research. Where's the activism in relation to the drones?
Right. I didn't even know about that. Did you know about that?
This is news to me.
This is news to me too.
But maybe it shouldn't be. So
Right.
thanks for pointing that out.
Right.
Could I mean,
That we could
By
talk
the
about.
way,
That we could respond to. That we could respond to.
I agree with you very much about
That's a good question.
what's happened in terms of greed and the growth of the financial sector and the fact that our smartest kids now go into investment banking. They go into making deals rather than making things. And I've had it out with the president on this one because I think he really chickened out. There were 5 banks that should be broken up. But we can't have one of these without controversy. And let me just say to you that having spent a lot of time in the war zones and knowing a lot of the people who were involved in the drone programs, I'm in favor. I think, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. But it's pretty damn good. And they're very, very careful about the targeting, number one. Number two, you don't think so? Give me evidence.
What about the son of Maliki, who was 16-year-old, who was killed by accident?
That's one. I said that's one. But you can't listen. Up on the Pakistani border, there have been several incidents where children were killed in drone strikes, and in every last case, they were children of well-known terrorists who were killing our troops there and trying to kill us here. I had lost 9 of my neighbors on September 11th, and these are bad people. And this is a good technology when used by a benign country. And this is the most benign superpower in the history of the world, even though we really screw it up sometimes, as we did by going to war in Iraq.
I won't weigh in on the drone question right now, but I will say one of the legacies of the economic changes that took place in the 60s and 70s that we alluded to before, and one of the legacies of the shrinking of what we consider to be common community in the United States is the shrinking of public resources for education, for many of the things that we hold dear, which means we are, at the University of Pennsylvania and many other institutions, relying more and more on corporate contributions, and many of them are by good people for good causes. I mean, we need, I think, to see them in a very broad way. But suffice it to say, one of the impulses from the 1960s that we've lost, I think, and that we've lost steadily in the period since, is the notion that there is a public good. And right now, higher education and the kinds of issues that Ira has committed his entire career to, the most important public good, arguably, that we provide to our citizens today is under siege all over the place. My son and daughter go to Philadelphia public schools, and my daughter's public school is losing 23% of its budget for next year because there are cuts that are happening at the federal and the state level, leaving these districts to fend for themselves. Universities like Penn will make it, but lesser institutions, public universities, public schools are under siege because of this narrowing of what we consider to be our common heritage, our common interest, our common society. And restoring that sense of commonality is crucial, I think, and that's the part of the 60s, if I were to call for a revival, that's what I'd revive.
And I actually think what all of us are saying, that issue of public service and the centrality of the idea of the Commonwealth idea, that we are intertwined, that our futures are inextricably connected in terms of what it means to be an American citizen. And what that means then for our neighbors. It's not just distance, it's how I deal with people locally. And on that issue of commercialism and commodification, one thing to note, and I'll just give this quickly historically, American universities have historically had very strong connections. And in fact, the growth of the great research university was on issues that people opposed in the 60s, the development of the academic military-industrial complex. It's not just the military-industrial complex. The role of MIT and Stanford and other universities in developing these huge infrastructures were enormous. And it was very much linked to large amounts of money. What's happened with the decrease of federal and the Cold War, what had happened with the decrease of supports, it has been a increased privatization, some of it for very good things. My center, in part, is relatively strong because we have people of goodwill from all political points of view who support the Netter Center. And so we have the names, it's a name center for that reason. But the issue is education for what? And that has to be raised in classrooms from pre-K through 20 plus. It is insufficient, and we're robbing our students if we educate them only to be, quote, commercially successful. Derek Bach, the president of Harvard, indicated that if universities do that, they will lose something that is irreplaceable. And what we have to be are the leading institutions that argue that those school issues are our issues, that we are on the front lines of helping to solve it, that they require universities, because we have the people from all different disciplines, and we are required to do it because otherwise we're cheating our students. We're not enabling them to develop the skills for life, and not just to be wealthy, but to be good people. Benjamin Franklin's key idea was do good, do well, be happy. He never believed that the key was to do well first. And that seems, particularly for Penn, to be historically significant, but also for all higher education, which is why I began by saying it ain't decided. And we need alums who support this here and elsewhere in your local communities to make clear of the educational significance and the moral role of higher education to help America achieve its purpose. So I couldn't agree more. Could not agree more.
One aspect of the student movement of the 60s was a turning in to the United States and avoiding the involvement with the world. In other words, the one I remember is the slogan, "Come Home, America." I'm wondering, particularly in the light of the discussion of feminism that was just treated, that we are now encountering a worldview which has very different ideas about how society should be organized, and certainly in the area of the role of women. And I'm wondering if the kind of confusion that the student movement of the 60s had in dealing with the challenge of communism isn't similarly reflected in their confusion about how to deal with the challenge of Islamism.
That's an interesting point. That's a very good point.
Well, I think that the greater worry
is
that people have just gotten really tired of us being overseas in wars that, in many cases, we should not have gotten into. My experience with the top ranks of the military was that they all thought Iraq was stupid from the beginning. There wasn't a phase 4, which is what you do when you take Baghdad. They actually didn't have that. And I think that we're coming into a really difficult period because whenever you look at the Middle East, I spend a lot of my time there, and you see countries with straight lines, you know that those lines were not drawn by the people who live there. They were drawn by Europeans. Sykes and Picot actually did most of the drawing. And what we're on the cusp of right now, and I think the president's being very wise to hang back from it, is a period when those lines are going to be obliterated. And we're going to find out what the actual countries in that region are. I don't know if there's a Jordan. I do know that there's a Kurdistan. I don't know if there's a Pakistan. In fact, I'm pretty sure there isn't. But I do know there's a Pashtunistan and a Baluchistan, and there's a Punjab that was divided by Lord Mountbatten very, very quickly in 1947 because his wife was having an affair with Nehru, and he wanted to get out of Dodge. 1 million people died on that border in 1947. And so I think that I'm really hoping that we're going to be wise about how we engage the rest of the world now, that we stay engaged, but we don't continue to do Western imperialist stupid stuff.
Very good.
I just thought one way to end this would be to ask a couple of questions, which is when we all graduated and there were fights to get one woman tenured in the English department, who thought that the next two presidents of Penn in a row would be women? Nobody.
Right.
Who thought that 11 states would allow homosexuals to marry?
Right. Right.
Who thought 2 states would allow you to smoke dope? And did anybody think that the President of the United States would be an African American?
Absolutely. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Very good, Bill. Very good.